produced by Himal South Asia is also here, and that is actually a very interesting film festival. You just have to register for the film festival, and if you do, you get a link, and that allows you to access the film for the weekend. So there are some fantastic films which you'll be able to see, and the information is on this piece of paper here over the weekend. And the final one is on a climate change activist in Pakistan. Her name is Parveen Rahman, the Rebel Optimist. And her film will be shown in Europe on March 20th. So we're collaborating with this film festival as well. So now let me introduce our speaker for today. Professor Nausheen Anwar is founder and director of Karachi Urban Lab and is Professor, City and Regional Planning, School of Economics and Social Sciences in the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. Nausheen received her PhD in City and Regional Planning from Columbia University and has held postdoctoral positions at Harvard and at the Asia Research Institute in Singapore. At the moment, Nausheen holds a joint appointment with the International Institute of Environment and Development, and she is the principal researcher and urban climate resilience leader in the UK. Nausheen's work looks at interactions between vulnerability, climate change impact, mostly heat, extreme heat and chronic heat, urban flooding, and post-colonial histories in context of infrastructure violence, land displacement, and anti-poor urban planning in urban global south. She is particularly interested in understanding the multidimensional risks and uncertainties that arise from interactions and the gender intersection implications and impacts on urban systems, people, and public health. Nausheen has received many grants, the list is very long, from the IDRC, UCRI, GCRF, ESRC, HRC, but Wellcome Trust, British Academy, RSA, and has published a lot. Many of you have read her work in the IJER, Antiquity, Urban Studies, South Asian History, Culture, Political Geography, PW, and she's also a member of several advisory boards, including the World Health Organization, the World Health and World Meteorological Organization. She's in the advisory board also of the program Humanities Urban Future, which is the Canada's new Institute for Advanced Studies here in Toronto. And welcome and thank you for coming, Nausheen. I'd also take a moment to introduce, we have the good fortune of having Professor Waqas Butt, who will be discussing Nausheen's paper. Professor Waqas Butt is a associate professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto. His areas of research focus on the politics of waste, caste, labor, and infrastructure as they unfold in Lahore. And his essays, anthropologists I'm sure have read, in the journals like Ethnos, American Ethnologist, and City. And most recently, his book was published from Stanford University Press last year, and it's called Life Beyond Waste, Work and Infrastructure in Urban Pakistan. So thank you so much for coming all the way and being a discussion with the Thank you, all of you. Once again, for the Nausheen.
Thank you so much, Shubhra. And indeed, it's a privilege and an honor to be back here at York today. Shubhra and I go back a long way, and it's always an immense pleasure and a privilege to be invited as a part of different kind of forums here at York University, and all of them organized by Shubhra. And when Shubhra says, Nausheen, you're coming to this talk, I know your name, are you coming or not? It's like, yes, ma'am. Don't you worry, I'll be on that flight, no problem. So what I would like to do today is to offer some ideas on what is a very, very preliminary book project. The word preliminary I underscore in bold. So don't be too harsh with me. And this is coming out of my ongoing work on extreme heat in Pakistan. So I focus right now on Karachi, but it might get extended into what has become the poster child for one of the hottest cities in South Asia. And I say poster child, there is a city known as Jacobabad in the southern province of Sindh, but that's part of another project that has already started in collaboration with colleagues over at King's College, London. But we'll see. For now, it's very Karachi. So, and one of the sort of the things that I'm playing around with is sort of splintered inhabitation. For the purposes of this talk today, I really don't get much into opening up the black box of what I mean by splintered, but it does kind of harken back to the work done by certain geographers, Ray Marvin and that lot, but maybe hopefully in a slightly different kind of way. So, as one of the main characters in Don DeLillo's novel White Noise, the made-up anthropologist Maris Kind describes the sensorial experience of urban life in terms of heat. Quote, heat, this is what cities mean to me. You get off the train and walk out of the station and you are hit with a full blast. The heat of air, traffic and people, the heat of food and sex, the heat of tall buildings, the heat that flows out of the subways and the tunnels. It's always 15 degrees hotter in the city. Heat rises from the sidewalks and falls from the poison sky. The buses breathe heat. Heat emanates from crowds of shoppers and office workers. The entire infrastructure is based on heat, desperately uses up heat, breathes more heat. The eventual heat death of the universe that scientists love to talk about is already well underway. And you can feel it happening all around you in any large or medium-sized city. Heat and wetness. The novel's main character, Jack Gladney, lives in a place where the pressures of urbanity are pervasive. DeLillo's protagonists critique the urban worlds in which natural landscapes are disappearing and being replaced by more complex ones due to the forces of technological change. Through Jack's walks, we learn about the achievements of advanced technology as it affects social relations. So in a sense, White Noise functions as an instructive story about ecological affairs. So when I was reading this novel, I found it useful to think about my ongoing ethnographic work on heat and urban life in Karachi. With an official population of 21 million, or maybe 25 million, or maybe 30 million, never entirely sure what that statistic should look like, Karachi is a teeming city located along the Arabian Sea in the southernmost province of Sindh, which is considered a significant hotspot for climate change. It is a city that is situated at a low altitude, hot, arid, subtropical climate, and an abundance of high-density, high-rise buildings, as well as urban sprawl, which is interspersed with asphalt, concrete, and limited green vegetation. Informal settlements make up nearly 65% of the city's dense housing. It could be more, it could be less, not entirely sure. The city's residents have long battled high temperatures and thermal discomfort. In the daytime, the average ambient temperature averages around 35 Celsius, although feels like temperatures can be considerably higher if we take into account what is officially known as WBGT, or the wet bulb growth temperature, that also takes humidity into consideration. The intensity and frequency of climate-related extreme weather events have increased over the years across Pakistan, and the province of Sindh has been hit probably the hardest. Cities like Karachi certainly at the forefront of these changes. So ranging from heat waves, chronic heat to devastating flooding, vulnerable poor populations are subject to the cascading and compounding effects I use this word similarly because they're so highlighted in the IPCC report of climate change on an annual basis. The 2015 heat wave, considered an unprecedented event across South Asia, killed well over 1,600 people in Karachi, although this number is highly disputed. It goes anywhere from 1,200, 1,500 up to 10,000. Even a cursory glance at the casualties suggests that the thermal penalty on certain citizens is or was in fact being imposed. Penalty that exemplifies the ground zero of social vulnerabilities and socioeconomic and spatial factors of injustice that underwrite the lives of ordinary citizens in cities like Karachi and many such cities across the South. Given the locations where people died in Karachi and where bodies were recovered, the people represented by that statistic, which is disputed, were killed by heat exposure. But these numbers represent only those bodies that were reported or died during or in the immediate aftermath of the heat. So heat is the ways individuals experience it, adapt to it, and work around it, and the impact it has on their daily routines has formed an essential component of daily rhythms and negotiations across different kinds of spaces. However, I don't necessarily approach Karachi as the scene of an unfolding dystopia, but like Murray's description of urban life in terms of heat, my research deals with the following questions. How does heat relate to the daily lives of people? How does it contribute to the production of new ideas about urban life in a major Pakistani city? And relatedly on cooling, because they're two sides of the same coin, what forms of new rulemaking are impacting people's modes of habitation and circulation of air? I'll come to that again. Today, I offer preliminary insights from ongoing ethnographic and survey research for the development thesis of the project. My fieldwork has focused on how people in Karachi make sense of their urban life world, yet do so with heat as a recurrent theme, shedding light on various understandings about a variety of uses, ideas, and meanings. But I do acknowledge the core assumption that heat has become a significant experience of the 21st century, an era presented as increasingly hot, crowded, unequal, full of thermal violence, and hence overheating. On thermal violence, I take a cue from Starosielski's work. Understanding heat is a process that alters the body's capacity to thermoregulate, perhaps in the form of slow violence. This is becoming alarming, but in a slightly. Has the city then become a sweatbox? The key operation of a sweatbox is to either concentrate heat, transforming one's body into storage medium for heat, something that shifts one's capacity for life, altering a person's breathing, metabolism, and awareness, a conscious technique constituted by manipulations of materials also, such as air conditioners, fans, clothing, water, food, ventilation systems, circulatory nodes or lack thereof, limiting movement, slowing down, withdrawing, sweat boxing. But amidst this violence, where the city may have become a sweat box for many, I also understand overheating as a concept borrowed from the anthropologist Hans Ericsson, who refers to the outcome of runaway change that is the unintended consequence of late modernity. In Ericsson's approach, overheating offers us a new perspective on energy use, urbanization, human mobility, immobility, and the spread of technology. He takes a cue from Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea of a world full of interconnected people and needing too many projects. I would like to be able to play with this idea and thinking about heat to see where it takes me conceptually and empirically. That's it. That's how the song goes. As rising temperatures become a global concern, it is more than ever relevant to study the significance of heat for everyday life. We need to understand how people navigate, govern, inhabit, and metabolize heat, and demonstrate new forms of agency and develop new bodies to cope with everyday life under hot conditions. Heat is linked to practices, it is embedded, and people have historically always related to heat, especially in South Asia. So if you talk to people in cities like Karachi or across Pakistan, urban India, and you talk about heat, people will always say that Hamisha is always hot. What's new? And there are also gender and intersectional dimensions to thinking about heat in terms of material, social, and cognitive. So my fieldwork has initially focused on people's risk perception of heat in relation to health, materials, livelihoods, and infrastructure. By this I mean people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, inhabiting various types of dwellings, homes across the city, as well as those informed and informal livelihoods. I've also been talking to healthcare professionals, to architects, and to state officials at various levels of government. Before I proceed to share with you some of the vignettes from a series of thermal diaries that my colleagues and I produced in 2022 that was based on an extensive project that we were involved in, I'd like to give you just a very quick overview of the surveys that we undertook across the city, especially in terms of location, methods, and so forth. So we did a very extensive survey in what was the summer of 2022, but it started in around about May, June of 2022, but it kind of went on until October, November, because we were interested in not only looking at the issue of heat waves, but also chronic heat, which is seasonal. And there is now very strong evidence to show that across other parts, and especially in the context of cities like Karachi, seasonal heat is actually extended. The summers come much earlier, they last longer. So trying to kind of complicate how we think about heat, not only just as a one-time event, something that lingers, that stays, that doesn't actually go away. So we conducted 13,000 surveys across 50 plus low-income and informal settlements. And we also conducted about 3,000 plus surveys of informal workers. This also included over 30 plus in-depth interviews, focus group discussions. And alongside this, we have all types of heat measurement. It was a very well-funded project. So we had the liberty of really kind of going all out, in terms of getting this heat measurement equipment. And assessing risk perceptions meant thinking about taking into consideration grounded experiences of thermal comfort, discomfort. Lots written on thermal discomfort, comfort, but I take a cue from Daniel Barber's amazing work. Their architect, who's done absolutely brilliant work talking about thermal comfort, discomfort in relation to the garden state and also in relation to mid-20th century discourses and practices of architects like Le Corbusier and others, and how the climate is actually very much at the forefront of how architects used to think about when they were designing houses in cities. And even people like Bouchard in cities like Karachi, air circulation, etc. But not based on active cooling. There was no air conditioning that were involved. Visually, those who are architects would appreciate this. So, and also then taking into consideration the intersections of embedded knowledges and applications, the usage, prevalence, and propositions within heat management, and the innovations and trade. And we worked pretty much throughout the city. We had a massive team, and we worked across all districts and taking into consideration something like 56 to 57 study sites and different types of environments and dwellings and so forth in architectural dynamics. Starting with the very inner parts of the city, and the ends that I was showing you were kind of focused somewhere on the edges of the city, and some that are internal, sort of more central to the city. And then a little factoid that 1/5 of all the respondents that we covered in the household survey spent 24 hours inside the home, and of these 77% were women. So, so we found that quite fascinating in terms of the gender aspect, thinking about thermal harm to bodies, that definitely gender, spatial, and embodied. And the equipment was used to kind of understand, what is heat? So heat is something that isn't just about ambient temperature. Heat is embodied, and then heat emanates from many different material dynamics. That's stored, it's about an overheated kitchen, it's about not enough ventilation. So we were interested in sort of looking at what these temperatures were telling us in terms of people's homes, and then sort of looking at these rhythms between different times of the day, different heat measurements, day morning, reading of heat radiating from a hotel at the backside of the respondent's trailer, and heat emanating from the shade that covered a respondent's trailer. These sorts of things we found quite productive. However, aside from this very extensive survey that we were involved in, what I have done, of course, is the ethnographic work is fundamentally missing. And as we generally, when we do ethnographic work, we do become inspired by the on-ground experiences and concerns of diverse interlocutors. And in doing so, it has become evident to me that an analysis of urban life is actually in terms of much more scope. So premise on scholarly attention to the promises of infrastructure, I'm referring to Brian Martin's work. I'm trying to unpack how the promise of a better future is taking shape, how the relations between you are being negotiated, and how the failure and maybe success of their terms might be leading to the ruination, as well as celebration of a not yet materialized future. So related to this then, I asked, what is the emergent site of state of rule setting around different forms of inhabitation that may or may not subject people to new codes and regulations concerning ventilation and cooling? Where and how is the air flowing? How is the state itself reaching into certain spaces with a new form of rulemaking? By this, I refer to codes or regulations that might be reconfiguring where how cool air flows. There is a whole colonial story to this also. You read the work of people like Jacques Chang and others in terms of codes and regulations that the colonial masters were particularly tuned into when they colonized cities. I also take a cue from only the Thames foundational work of rhythm analysis, which presents how rhythm is constituted of the repeated practices and activities at specific time. It thus addresses various aspects of social life involving lived spaces and the environment, alongside the relationship of individuals with that spaces. And certain scholars like Helsel Oakman have deployed the concept rhythm analysis to explore heat and heat stress through its role in the routine cycles of daily life, as rhythm analysis provides a lens through which time and space can be visualized in tandem. Rhythm analysis is a method through which the nuances and intricacies of daily life can be understood and analyzed. It allows for engagement with the multidimensional and extensive relationship of characters of the relative and heat. How might we move to rhythm analysis of the South Asian city is the question. Notably, the successes and failures of these rhythms, movements, and negotiations are unfolding against a backdrop of state-led actions to establish greener and more affordable energy futures for Pakistan. Affordable energy futures that are also coal-fired, fossil fuel-fed comfort for many. Mastering heat in an everyday sense is then deeply implicated in narratives about Pakistan's ambition to be granted the status of energy self-sufficiency and to facilitate thermal comfort of its citizens. Heat pen and even cooling appear here as a material substance to be mastered in order to produce more viable urban futures. How might we interpret urban heat pen? This can be interpreted in terms of men and women navigating at various scales from the home to the neighborhood to the broader city, maintaining livelihoods and searching for new ones. I include here also health practitioners trying to master the discourse of heat. Corporeal perceptions and understandings of moving about within the home, daily neighborhood entail dealing with the city's context, its contingencies and challenges. Under certain circumstances, this can lead to profound feelings of extreme overheating or bodily wasting caused by this, perhaps a metabolic disruption, question mark. For the city's health practitioners, heat is an event-based threat and understood as a single variable temperature-driven factor. And in this context, we interviewed a whole bunch of health practitioners, medical practitioners, 1 to 2 hour long semi-structured interviews with epidemiologists, with physiologists, public health physicians, general physicians, heads of emergencies in hospitals such as the Afan University, and of course representatives of the Pakistan Medical Association. So just a few quotes. So one medical doctor said, quote, as a public health physician, I look at it, or heat, in numbers. How many people are dying? Heat events occur once in a while for a few days a year. And if a few hundred people die, it's still a low risk infection, end quote. Another medical practitioner said, if you want to look at how people perceive heat and consider heat, that's another angle. But in terms of epidemiology and mathematically, there are indices which you can use, but there is no consensus on it, end quote. For health practitioners, people's vulnerability to heat is understood as something that is grounded in physiological parameters such as immunity, body reserves, but is also gendered. As another health practitioner said, quote, Garmi mard ki bimari hai. Heat is a man's illness. This was actually the senior representative of Pakistan Medical Association. On acclimatization and thermoregulation and spaces, a medical doctor from the Afan University noted, human bodies are highly adaptable to their environment. However, the way our environments are planned and have been developed to restrict our ability to thermoregulate, and houses no longer have good ventilation systems, and temperature-controlled indoor environments limit our interaction with changing atmosphere. This is kind of a gesture to failed urban planning or remote cleaning up for that. On the knowledge of rhythms and practices concerning the daily management of heat in the city, another health practitioner underscored, quote, if you go to Garo, which is the city not too far from Karachi, as soon as there is a heat wave there, the laborers stop working. They immediately take a break and sit in shade for a few hours. They put wet cloth on their heads or wrap it around themselves to fight the heat. The state laborers are not allowed to do that here. So in the city, you're expected to work, whether it's sunny or whether there's garam hawa or hot air. Acclimatization is possible, provided you learn trade and work. So moving away from health practitioners, elsewhere in Karachi's old, dense commercial area, Sadr, female street vendors install umbrellas to shield themselves from glare. They sit on small plastic stools that offer some protection against the heat emitting from the concrete footpath. Even in winter, the long hot days take a toll on the women's body. It is not uncommon for them to fall ill due to the intense and hazardous threshold of bodily capacities that are constantly pushed to their thermal physiological tolerance limits. Across town, in neighborhood lanes, on roadside, parking lots, under bridges and median trees, outdoor workers try to pass time in whatever form of shade they can find. A perpetual quest to seek protection from extreme heat and other forms of radiant emission emanating from the built environment and from the rising temperature due to global warming and intensifying urban fatality. But finding shade and holding on to it has become risky business in Karachi, where outdoor workers must negotiate shade policing, and where green cover in the form of trees and cooling spaces such as parks have diminished considerably in the past 20 years. And this is the whole article that my colleagues and I actually wrote on the radical politics of shade, which was published in studies last year, as part of a special issue on heat. And this was taken up actually in my business call on thinking about the right to shade in a more radical way. But we kind of tried to reposition it in terms of taking clarity and think about a radical politics of shade in the context of urban salvation. For street vendors, heat is God's wrath. Fruit juice seller who earns rupees 1,500 per day, works from 10:30 a.m. to 1 a.m. He experiences peak heat hours from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. He explains that he felt worse when it was hotter, that he sweats a lot, and this aggravates his emotions. That said, he didn't feel angry because of the heat, only when someone was making him feel angry, something he ascribed to his faith. Quote, how can someone feel angry at God's will? Narratives about the management of heat also include references to the state of monitoring, to state neglect, and to rapid urbanization. So let me move very quickly to offering you sharing with you some vignettes from our thermal diary. So in that same summer of 2022, my colleagues and I shadowed with that commission 4 to 5 respondents who agreed to work with us in terms of shadowing them in their place of work and their homeless work. And in doing this shadowing, we were trying to get a sense of, when they move through the city, what these movements look like, and what are their body experiences of heat through their workspaces and living spaces. So I'll offer very quickly, just summarize some of these vignettes in the hope that you might find them of interest. The first is fisherman Musa. Musa is a fisherman who lives in Malwa Padi, in Ibrahim Hedri, southern part of the city overlooking the Arabian Sea. He lives with 4 family members in a house that is 31 by 33 feet. He earns about 600 rupees per day. The home is made of concrete blocks with an old panoplex attached to provide shade. The 2 main rooms have an attached bathroom. There are ceiling fans and ventilating windows. The rooms are 13 by 13 feet each, separated by a 5-foot to 13-foot bathroom. There is also a tiny veranda. The space of the veranda is occupied by a kitchen, an outdoor store, and a tree, and an open space covered by a large tree. Drinking water is stored in a large-sized water drum. The family pays about 100 rupees per day for water. Electricity load shedding lasts for 10 to 12 hours per day. Musa works from 2 p.m. to 8 a.m. and fishing season lasts from August to May, which are generally hot months, with December to February being relatively cooler. Musa experiences peak heat hours between 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. For Musa, heat is understood through water politics, through varying catches of fish, and the changing patterns of rain. In Musa's neighborhood, heat navigation is a communal experience. Facing and coping with heat and poverty as a community, residents of Ibrahim Hedri work together to clear the way for a jetty, where ships can be docked, repair work is done, and where they can all sit comfortably at a park that the bishop opens, themselves are constructed. Spaces like the Otak offer a way to deal with extreme heat. Community members often gather at the Otak when electricity load shedding happens. Beautician Huma. As we move from Ibrahim Hedri to District Malid, from District Malid to Musa Colony in the more central part of Karachi, we meet Huma, who is 35 years old, with a husband, 2 sons, and a daughter. She lives in a 60 square foot house on busy Market Street. The house has 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a corridor with a kitchen at the end. Huma complains that her house gets hotter at night. There are a total of 3 ceiling fans installed in the house and pedestrian fans with batteries attached, so it can keep functioning when there is no electricity. The household used to rely on an air conditioner but removed it because of high electricity bills. There is no public supply of water, so the family rely on tankers. Huma actually prefers to stay long hours in her beautician workspace because there are no electricity issues there. During hotter days, there is more work to be done at home because Huma makes specific kinds of food like khichdi. Heat makes her angrier and she often lashes out at customers when they bargain too much. And she also fights with her husband. So she says, quote, men feel hotter because औरत को सबर की ताकत दी है. God has given women more patience. Men, if they ever felt hot, can easily lash out. औरत की मिट्टी ज़्यादा गर्म होती है. I don't know quite how to translate that. But women took Australian, she said. Huma attributes the overheated city to a growing population, diminishing trees and pollution. She said, Mother Earth is upset with us because of our sins. हर जगह कीड़े पड़ रहे होते हैं, mess everywhere. The streets used to be densely lined with trees next to all the houses, but now you can't spot a single tree. Plots for a single family that used to have trees and a garden are now used to accommodate 16 families, causing more congestion, more heat, and there is no space for greenery anymore. On hot evenings, everyone would come out of their houses and line their charpais under the trees and relax, but there is no way to do that anymore. On very hot days, Huma says that she prefers to wear certain types of clothing to combat heat. She doesn't wear black scarves because she said it tans the skin. Covering up makes her feel hotter, but believes that it is important because of higher modesty. Wearing a cap helps to protect against the sun. She eats salad and drinks lots of water and lassi to keep cool. She doesn't eat fish or fire in the summer. Then she made a very noteworthy comment. The more we try to fight the heat, the more we will feel it, end quote. She prefers wearing long shalwar kameez, and her sons and husband sometimes choose not to wear shirts at all. She also tells us that living in an area with many buildings is good because it blocks sunlight and heat, which is an interesting comment because the conventional view is that in high-density built-up areas, these are generally hotter. But this comment nevertheless also contradicts her earlier statement that at night the house gets hotter despite of something to do with urban heat time effect. And then there is also the issue of her overheated kitchen that never cools at any point in time of the day or night. Asma, who is a maid and attendant at the university where I work, at IBA. Asma, who is 40 years old, keeps the bathroom clean at IBA. And this is Asma, who works at the southern campus of the university where I work at. It has two campuses. One is sort of, which is a much bigger campus, slightly far away from the central part of the city. And this is in the central part of the city in southern, which is probably one of the oldest parts of Karachi. It's a much smaller and more dense space compared to the other campuses. Asma keeps the bathroom clean at IBA, which is essentially a conditioned campus. However, workers like Asma are not allowed to sit inside the empty classrooms and offices to cool off. Asma is only allowed to sit in a space that is directly outside the bathroom. This space is not necessarily shaded and exposed to heat in its many different forms. Like most of IBA's cleaning staff, Asma has been hired on a contract basis through an external agency. She earns rupees 25,000 per month and works 8.5-hour shifts from 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., but Sundays are off. She lives in Purana Golimar in District East, another very old neighborhood in Karachi. She lives with her husband, 2 sons and 2 daughters. She starts the day around 7 or 8 a.m. The duty of chores like cooking and cleaning is not compulsory for her. So she leaves work at 9:30 a.m. The distance to IBA from her house is 10 minutes, but it takes her around 25 to 30 minutes to cover the distance to traffic and walking and traveling in a rickshaw and bus that are part of her daily commute. Asma's flat comprises 1 bedroom, a bathroom, and a kitchen, and is located at the 6th or top floor of a fairly dilapidated building. The only source of ventilation is a window and patches of little black square. Asma pays a rent of about rupees 12,000 per month that doesn't include electricity and water. Typically, there is 7.5 hours of load shedding. Being on the top floor makes the flat hotter as direct solar exposure hits the cement roof structure, so Asma complains of intense heat day and night. Interestingly, however, she says that her workspace at IBA is even hotter. So she is mindful about her clothing. At home, she does find time to recuperate, but at IBA there is constant improvement. from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., and 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. These are the hottest parts of the day on the campus. But perhaps the good trip is also because she finds the work environment is hostile and the male workers try to boss her around. She says that the heat increases her anger, and when she comes home, she lashes out at the children. So I'd like to turn now very quickly to the idea of rulemaking in terms of cooling. So to what extent are these splintered inhabitations around heat being impacted by new modes of rulemaking about cooling? I refer here to circulations of cool air that are remaking certain parts of the city. What kinds of cool air flows are being planned and who are the recipients? In a very simple sense, middle class versus strong environment. How are interactions between people, the built environment, climate, changing in relation to thermal comfort? This is a part of the project. This part of the project relies on understanding the role of local and global building regulations and codes concerning health and air quality that dovetail with the increasing energy demand for cooling across southern Pakistan, within the larger context of the kind of energy infrastructure that are being built. The Building Energy Code of Pakistan has been prepared by the National Energy Conservation Center, Planning and Development Division, Government of Pakistan. It was planned in May 1990. There is an entire chapter devoted to the building code that sets criteria to establish minimum energy conservation requirements for buildings. On natural ventilation, it says, quote, there should be adequate ventilation when the wind does not come from the prevailing direction. To obtain adequate airflow and velocity inside the building, the position of the opening relative to wind direction and the position and size of opening in adjacent opposite walls should be carefully designed. Acceptable practices for building ventilation should be in accordance with the ASHRAE handbook, ASHRAE being the American. That's okay, it can be done. I don't have any more slides. So ASHRAE being the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineering. So in accordance with ASHRAE handbook of fundamentals, chapter 2, edition 1989, chapter 3, building code. The Ministry of Housing and Works Environment and Urban Affairs Division refers to the ASHRAE standards for minimum performance standards. Quote, this code gives minimum performance standards for building windows and opening, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, which is all about HVAC, systems, equipment, and lighting. So based on ASHRAE standards, every effort has been made to ensure its applicability in our building. End quote. But minimum standards apply only to centrally air-conditioned buildings, for instance, malls, luxury high-rises, and corporate offices, which are now increasingly pervasive across cities in Pakistan, especially in places like Karachi. A wide spectrum of buildings are not on the radar for example, for constructed informal settlements and lower neighborhoods, precisely the sorts of places in which people like Musa, Ismail, and die. However, thinking about the codes that rule cool air in circulation also forces us to consider what are those codes that are being violated. According to the Sindh Building Control Authority, from 2008 to 2014, 1,377 buildings were officially completed out of 28,000 permit applications. But slightly over 18,000 buildings were completed without permits, and almost 6,000 were demolished due to violations of building regulations. What is the typical violation? Building on open recreational spaces or green spaces, flood zones, adding floors to a building without permit, converting residential plot to commercial and vice versa without permit, illegal construction, especially in the inner city, which has led to increasingly higher density, more vertical construction, even in informal working class environments, ground plus 2, plus 3, plus 4. For the residential land use now, the Sindh Building Control Authority has banned construction of above ground plus 2 stories of residential plots over 120 square yards across Karachi. Nevertheless, ground plus 3, ground plus 4 continues to expand with more and more concrete in circulation. So they're setting down the pathway of trying to understand the role of ventilation cooling in informal and urban settings in relation to this. What are working class households saying about cool air flows? What are their perceptions? So we conducted 19 preliminary household surveys as part of the pilot project, in which we interviewed 6 women and 12 men. The location was Agra Raj Colony in Gary Town, South, another very, very old working class neighborhood in Karachi, very high density. with acute shortages of electricity supply, where load shedding is typically 8 to 9 hours per day throughout the year, and piped water available only for 2 to 3 hours at night. And household density is typically 8 to 10% per household. Even though a few respondents claim to have included ventilation as part of the initial design of their homes, they were conscious about the implications of wind direction and ventilation on the current layout of the houses. All respondents were aware of the orientation of homes as the east open or west open, and how this contributed to certain rooms being comparatively hotter, those located towards the eastern side and others being relatively cooler throughout the day, those that faced the side lane and exposed to a west blowing breeze. A female respondent explained that the location of her house at the end of the lane, which was oriented along the southwest axis, made her house cool throughout the year and a gathering spot for women in the area. So for these women, the primary need was not cool roofs or even insulation, but rather much more basic and mundane improvements to doors and windows to ensure they close properly or open properly. Here, climate change is largely irrelevant, and energy efficiency of secondary importance to just having access to services such as electricity and water. So to conclude very quickly, in my ongoing work, I'm trying to demonstrate that urban heat may be understood in two ways. First, as a personal, embodied experience, and second, as a quantifiable or statistical thing, a relationship with built environment and technology. It is a productive force, but also a destructive. There is an old colonial story built in here, but I don't have time to get into it. There doesn't appear to be, however, one overarching story about how ordinary citizens navigate heat and cooling. But excess death also signal a slow onset of violence, differentially produced and differentially lived through being intimately tied to the social reproduction of class, of race and gender and age, and architecture and urban planning, the spatial aspect of this being very important. And tied also to social reproduction. Bodies live and carry, they become technologies of circulation, they function as accumulation strategies and enable sociological fixes. So in and through their uneven infrastructural work, these bodies are differentiated. They also break down overheating and thermoregulatory disruption, some kind of metabolic disruption that involves the body that brings the city and the body together. A lot of work on metabolism in relation to what is the city, of course, you know that vocals and people. Lots of things about the heat in the city and the body itself. So other heat then is a bodily and material substance. People experiment, learn, and cope based on their cases and circumstances in Karachi. But there is something to be said about how splintered inhabitations are being reworked through new circulations of cool air, airflows, through perhaps new forms of rulemaking, the possibility of taking a deeper look at the role of the state in this messy, but what I think is a very. Thank you very much. So, do I stand? Do I sit? I can do it. Okay.
I don't. Sorry, very fast. So, actually, thank you so much, Nausheen, for that really fascinating and magnificent talk. I really enjoyed reading your work. The more recent work, but your earlier work on energy sort of infrastructure over the years. And it's always been sort of super inspiring, both intellectually and sort of political implications. And I think, you've always sort of been able to bring these sort of really important connections between the site, infrastructure, urban space, geography, energy, and now heat, and allows us to rethink a lot of our own questions and concerns. So I'm really sort of grateful for this opportunity. And I so also offer my thanks to Shubha for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. So I prepared some comments based off what I thought the talk was going to be about, and luckily a lot of the stuff still stuck with what you were saying, but there's more in the talk as well. And so, but also as you're talking, I wanted to sort of keep track of the things that I didn't expect about the talk. And one was sort of, and I'm curious to hear about this a little bit of you opening the paper with literary reference of white noise specifically, and why start obviously with that particular story, but going to literature to frame the talk rather than doing a very kind of this is the theoretical implications of the work. So I want to sort of, and this will come back. I'll come back to this maybe towards the end, where I think about heat as a kind of archive, or a methodological archive, but also historical. And so there are so many other things that I wanted to sort of just flag, and maybe in the Q&A can come up from just the talk that you gave. When you talked about sweatbox, you're sort of this thing that alters the body's capacities. And when you said sweatbox, the first thing that came to my mind was sweatshop, right? And that idiom of thinking about labor that's sort of happening in a sort of contained space and its effect on bodies and around sweat specifically. And so, yeah, and other things will come in through my comments. So just those things that I kind of didn't necessarily think about that I think are really sort of provocative kind of approach that you took in this work. And so just with that, I'll kind of start with my comments. And I prepared comments under sort of three themes that I thought would be significant about what you're trying to do. And one is I sort of organized under the theme of theories of power and theories of heat. And here I'd like to begin with the title of the talk, which you mentioned in the beginning but didn't want to get into it. Maybe this would be an opportunity to talk more about that. I found this title, Splintered, Inhabitations, quite interesting. I think it reveals something. A title is always powerful in that way, the way that it reveals something, right? About climate change and contemporary forms of urbanization. And my inclination was right when you sort of referenced Graham Marvin's or splintering urbanism, which I think, as many people in the room are aware of, really rethought the urban question among geographers, anthropologists, urban planners, etc. And I think a key contribution of that volume, and I think this is something that you're developing, or you develop quite well, is that the urban question often requires new conceptual grammars and theoretical frameworks if we want to sort of think about our contemporary politics. And it inaugurated a conversation, that particular volume, of the city as a network society, and in a way in which sort of social technical systems have distributed effects. And I feel like that was a very kind of key contribution of that thing, of that sort of edited volume. And I think this is where heat and the way in which you talk about heat becomes so significant in rethinking those earlier conversations. And I want to sort of think about, and maybe you can speak to this in the Q&A, we often think of systems of power through instances of violence, right? Whether physical or metaphorical violence, right? So in the description for the talk today, you talk about how weapon is weaponized in urban planning and architecture. And that violence is selective, right? It impacts certain persons or bodies and not others, right? It has a distributed quality to it, right? It's distributed across the social body. But I sense that there's something that happens with heat inequality that is not necessarily about violence, right? And that is, you mentioned this a little bit, it's about differentiated feelings of comfort and pleasure. How can some enjoy or take pleasure and comfort and others who cannot? Right? How does this labor of some support the comfort of others? And these sorts of questions. And I think that participates in what you referenced, Rob Nixon's sort of conversation around slow violence. At times and this is I think a conversation that those medical professionals are having, even though they don't have the sort of vocabulary for it, right? At times when heat reaches a certain temperature, it certainly kills, right? That's undeniable. But it also diminishes life, and this is where the slow violence question becomes very significant. And I think it says something about how we think about time and experience of the temporality of heat, maybe is one way to mark it, right? Is, death from heat marks a particular moment in time. It marks the end of life, right? And that's quite often how we think about the effects of it, right? Heat stroke, heat death. But the impact of rising heat is more diffused in bodies in time, right? The effects, I'm interested in you talking about the compounded unintended effects, right? It increases mortality, right? Thanks to heat exposure, right? It related to other disease illnesses, kidney failure, more specifically. And I think, right, what you're getting at in this thing is this raises important legal and questions and governance matters around responsibility, injury, risk, and harm, right? And this is slightly different than what you said yourself about the perception of risk, right? This is about a kind of legal governance infrastructure around, right? And I found that really, really compelling. So I think this sort of consideration of heat and, maybe the conversation in this series around climate dystopias is how do we need to rethink our theories of power and urbanism, right? Especially around questions of harm and risk. There's many other kinds of things we can consider within, right? And so maybe if you could pose it as a question to be answered in the Q&A is, how have you thought about the relationship between power, climate dystopia, and thermal dystopia? So I'm just going to keep a track on time. And so the second set of theme I organized under, or second set of questions, I organized under the theme as dash mass infrastructure, heat, homes, and people. And I don't want to return to this heading at the bottom on splintering urbanism, but I think Nausheen raises sort of important questions about, this kind of, what was called, the infrastructural turn, right? And, how so many of us, myself included, are sort of caught up in that, and its sort of productivity, right? And there's so many things that this was meant to draw attention to, right? Thinking about systems of exploitation in sort of dynamic ways, foregrounding socio-technical sort of systems of accumulation and circulation, and also, and might be most directly tied to some of the comments that, or point that she was bringing up, it thematized the non-human yet material substratum of social. I think there's something there about infrastructure and heat that it pushes us kind of at the limits of how to think about something. If you can, even that's sort of common. And so, Nausheen sort of paraphrase as I will, Brian Larkin, as the sort of infrastructures are things themselves, so pipes, wiring, et cetera, and those things make other things possible: power, water provisioning, information, databases. And I think the talk today really made me focus more on the sort of splintered inhabitations and what you're getting us to reconsider. And here I just want to talk briefly about waste, right? Because it's so much been the object of my research, but I think there's something comparison between waste and heat might be a productive kind of space to think about these infrastructures. And so waste, I've kind of come to terms, is made and remade through infrastructure. Right? What we think of waste, what waste is or what waste is not, is constitutively entangled up with its infrastructures. You really can't think of waste outside of that, right? It's hard, almost impossible, to separate waste from infrastructure. And so, that was significant for what my research on waste infrastructures in Lahore and across various cities in urban Punjab, when I thought about sort of informal settlements similar to the ones you're probably working in as infrastructural in some nature, right? Houses, not as infrastructures themselves, one can make that argument, but provide our infrastructural, this quality of those houses that are infrastructural in the sense they enable the movement, right, of waste, for example, and money. And so when I was thinking about these things, that's why when I read your title, and I was struck by this use of inhabitations, in the title, in the talk a little bit more, you don't use the words homes or housing in the title, right? Nor are they clearly infrastructure, right? That's what I'm trying to think about. And inhabitation is something that seems wider or broader, right? And it's the act of inhabiting, to live or occupy a place. Right? It references the sense of dwelling in a place, right? And in that act, being at home or making a home. Right? And so I want to think about this sort of, when you talk about inhabitation, what is the role of infrastructure, right? Is infrastructure there, or is it something separate from infrastructure completely? And it seems to me that heat is unique in the sense it's not an object in the way that it's then allows for us to think about it infrastructurally. It's more diffuse than something like waste. And when you were talking about the sort of perceptions, it was all around them in the sense of both in the atmosphere, but also in the particular door in a way that's open or closed, or the quality of the materials being used, right? And that I think really makes us rethink this sort of infrastructural question and this sort of distributed effects, right? And just generally, how have you approached this sort of thinking about inhabitation as an atmosphere? I'll say there's one way to do it, or as sort of a medium for social life, right? There's some stuff on, you very nicely talked about sort of the gendering of heat, right? Both the sort of perceptions of the heat by men and women, and how men and women are different power, tolerance. But how heat itself is gendered in some way was interesting. that heat is something that is the sort of monopoly of humanity, right? And there's so much there that I think is really, really rich. I'll come back to this, maybe skip a few things, just come to my last sort of theme, which was sort of heat as an archive. And with the fact that global warming is no longer a future, right, to be expected. So much of the early writing, I think, on climate and history and this kind of stuff was this expectation that it's in the future still, right? And it's now part of the now, right? It is present and it's being experienced all the time, right? It's almost overly present in our lives in some way in our discourses. We are living sort of that history on a daily, everyday basis. As we all kind of are sweating in this room right now, right? There's this spat of warmth in Toronto, right? And it becomes part of conversation. And it's interesting what you were saying that heat was always heat was always there, so what does it matter? So the weather talk, there's something new about that, right? And I think the weather talk is always has been politicized because of global warming. But it's also become something that I think has methodological kind of concerns, right, about human research. And so one part of it that I want to maybe ask Nausheen to sort of tell us about is whether or not or how you sort of quote unquote discovered heat as something, right? Both intellectually, I think, right? It could be the recent heat waves, right? That the 2000s or the 2015, I think, was one of the big heat waves in Karachi. Yeah, and that really came in, and I remember I was in Lahore at the time, and that heat wave generated a certain public discourse, right? That didn't quite exist before. But there is always with heat, there's always, I think, because it's a medium, there's always this moment of how do you discover it, how do you become a tool? And I think there's something in your work that addresses that. And so the other one is, and this will be my last comment, to think about heat and what sort of methodological questions, concerns, and uncertainties, right? And sort of uncertainty is very key actually in the project that I'd like to hear about. And I think one thing that I've been struck by is sort of for people who do some kind of field-based research, right? This presence of heat in Pakistan, South Asia, especially in the summer months, is right something that really can't be ignored from doing field work, right? Every time I have a conversation with a grad student returning from summer research in India, Pakistan, etc., the impact of hotter weather is something that they're consciously talking about, right? And how it's not just how it's impacting them, but how it's impacting the type of work they can do, when they can do it, where they can do it, right? And in new research, I'm starting with sort of water and agriculture, ecologies. I found myself having similar conversations with a friend who researches in Pakistan as well as a friend and colleagues here, and I sort of strategize around that, right? When is it possible for me to have research? What could that research look like? And I think the topic to me opens up a really sort of powerful archive. And it's another way of thinking about how does heat and thermal become an archive, and its relationship to sort of histories of or colonialism. Right? That's one thing that I also wanted to ask about. And this idea, and I know I've talked to Shubhra about this, but this idea of the tropics and arid climates, right? And how, especially in the case of Punjab, it's in how the aridness of this environment, it stimulated some sort of interventions, especially around the now. And so I think those kinds of ways are places where he could become a really kind of powerful archive that both links the sort of present of the nowness of climate change, sort of pastness of these issues as well. So those are just some sort of comments, and hopefully, I don't know how you wanted to Q&A.
If I can address all of that, I'm sorry, I can do either.
Yes.
It's so brilliant, so I really did not expect anything less from you. That's such amazing comment. Such provocative. It's actually a brilliant comment. And, I didn't know you would talk about this. So, with the first one, why did I choose Dharma? Because it's like, and I had to read it. And when I was reading it, I was like, okay. So over the last 4 years that I've been working on it, and it goes back quite a bit. I think it was a grant. So it was a big grant, a big part of money, and it was a colleague who was very interested in doing this. And he was always there as part of sort of more strategic, methodological fieldwork aspect of how do we go about working in the height of summer. Those always there, and especially sort of also managing research assistants. They don't paint in the field and those sorts of things, and rethinking methods and rethinking ethics also. What does it mean actually to place young researchers in the field under these present circumstances? So when Smart came along, kind of opened up a new window. So it also opened up a conversation with colleagues who are anthropologists, who are physiologists, health practitioners, geographers who work very specifically on heat, like my colleague of health, but Oakman, and then science and technology specialists like Alok Madhika over at the Technology Institute, which is amazing, amazing work. And the head of our urban map, my auntie's work, part of a collaborative project on food infrastructure like New York City. So it sparked a series of conversations which then led me down this road. And then energy, and then I began to see the connections that the energy infrastructure was being incredibly important in that conversation. And so just water, but then kind of opening it up along this system. But I think that windows open also because it pulls me away a little bit from thinking about the heat story as a dystopic or a nightmare. I think that's where reading that novel, and that's why, just for the purpose of this talk today, I wanted to use it as an opener. Because I think that what I want to really say is that I understand the term of violence, the term of threat box, which actually I take from Strada's Gelsenkirchen's work. She uses the notion of the threat box in terms of the threat box that was used to discipline slaves on American plantations. So, and it's a very, very powerful idiom to think about how in the city, as a result of the violence of urban planning the past 150 years of modern urban planning history, which has always been very violent, how we might think about how certain types of bodies are then disciplined. Precisely the kinds of bodies that I've been talking about, Homa, and these are all pseudonyms, and Asma and Musa, the fisherman, and all that these bodies are also, there's a certain element of self-disciplining also, the self-governing also that is involved. And this also has to do with sort of the heat wave management plans and how the entire sort of responsibility of managing heat has actually been shifted onto individual bodies, both in India and Pakistan. The state is actually not doing much, right? So the state kind of takes out these heat management plans where it says that, oh, a heat wave is coming, and so the Pakistan Meteorological Department, much like the Indian Meteorological Department, issues a warning. There's been far more critique on this in India than there is in Pakistan. So a lot of my conversations are actually part of very highly interactive debates with colleagues in India, or those working on India in terms of heat. So the PMD issues a warning, and then the district commissioner said everybody stays indoors. But we know the dangers of indoor overheating also. These are the indoor spaces, whether you call them homes or you call them households or you call them certain modes of inhabitation, are also certain kinds of environments that are part of a naturally climate heat, but they're also overheated spaces because of the kind of concrete and asphalt and mortar that has been poured into them. And although the equipment that we hired for our project and used it kind of made us very aware of the kind of infrastructure that we're looking at, these are overheated infrastructure. And there might in certain instances also be melting infrastructure. Right? So what does the body do with infrastructure, to quote Malik Simon in this context? How do bodies and infrastructure play out in that sense? So I think that Ethan opens up a window into many different ways of thinking about infrastructures. So infrastructure then is not quite that thing that holds together, as Dark and Light have talked about and others as well. And then even body as infrastructure itself, there is this metabolic destruction that happens. So, but I want to kind of keep it in terms of my own work. I also want to see what is the productive side, right? In terms of how people are negotiating without necessarily romanticizing. And I think that as I've been involved in this work, as my ethnography continues, and I hope I'm starting a new project in Jacob. The Jacob story, I didn't even include it in the title. The Jacob story is even more fascinating, actually. Because we're looking at ambient temperature thresholds over there that cross 52 Celsius. What does that even mean? So this is a whole region across then, not just Jacobabad, but many other cities. Colonial constructed Jacobabad, named after the colonial officer. So you walk into the district commissioner's office, and the big portrait that you see is Lord Jacob, and then Jinnah, which is teeny tiny, photograph somewhere. And that's really worth mentioning because, the sort of the ode to the colonial heritage is huge. But in Jacobabad, ambient temperature thresholds have passed 52 Celsius. But you walk around in the lanes of the old city and you talk to shopkeepers who who project certain forms of shade, and you look at the old colonial buildings over there where other kinds of shopkeepers are sitting in the ceiling fans and very high ceilings and so forth, and people say, oh, we're accustomed to this. So then on the one hand, you have this whole meteorological discourse of temperature. This is what has a colonial context, right? So we know that historical geographers have done amazing, especially the British historical geographers have done amazing work on weather and heat and how the entire meteorological discourse was built and how it kind of then moved in terms from company art to crown art, how it shifted. So that, it was first something that was bad, and then it was something after the shift to crown rod, something that you could accommodate, because then you would go up to the hills and you would disappear. So it's quite very, very fascinating. But the meteorological aspect of it, the statistical aspect of it has not disappeared. And that really, really dominates how policies and plans are also made, how adaptation and resilience is also formed. So for meteorologists and even bureaucrats and government representatives, heat talk, and even for medical doctors, heat talk is all about temperature. And this is one of the things that I'm trying to show in my work. I'm trying to parse it apart. That heat talk has, urban heat has these many different dimensions. And even the embodied experiences of heat are complex as we move across the different spaces. And how people access cooling is also fairly complex. So it's not necessarily true that people don't have access to cooling. And there's a story over here also about second-hand B-grade air conditioners from places like Jackson Market in Karachi, where these ship ACs that are coming from Japan are being smuggled from Afghanistan are then retrofitted to be used in informal settlements and low-income. And they can cool down different spaces also to a certain extent, and people are accessing them. So then there is this kind of, most Japanese, novel, this whole story of how the elite had access to this and the poor don't. And it's kind of, stories get a bit complex, right? I'm not saying that every household in informal settlement and in poor people's homes people don't have access to, but they can access certain types of cooling. So what are these stories telling us, right? That it's not necessarily a dystopic nightmare kind of situation, but maybe something a little bit more lowbrow, in between, something a little bit more nuanced, and that's what I'm trying to get at. Not very successfully at this juncture, but in terms of the questions that you pose, this is what I'm trying to get at. In the coming year to 2 years, or however long it's going to take you to get this entire story together, and maybe the entire project will shift to shape about that. Or maybe it can get comparative context of Karachi. I mean, one story. So I'll give you another example. For instance, climate science. There's something to be said about the scientific knowledge in terms of how climate scientists are talking about humidity. So on this new project that I'm leading with Dr. Tom Matthews, who's a climate scientist at King's College London, we were having a discussion. This is a very totally Jacobite for this project. So we're talking about humidity, and I was telling him that in Jacobabad, the district commissioner was telling me that, extreme heat is really not an issue. The issue is access to housing, access to infrastructure, to water, and so forth. Extreme heat is not an issue. You talk to local NGOs over there, and they generate it. Because they're the ones who are there on ground and really from settlements, and they present it kind of. But the DC told me that the humidity factor in Jacobabad, humidity has been rising because of the kind of agricultural practices that have unfolded over there over the last 100 years or so. So it's waterlogging in the fields, which is raising the humidity level. So when I was talking about this with Tom, he said, that absolutely, that's side behind. So this humidity then looks very different from the humidity that you see in Karachi, which was in the midst, near the Arabian Sea. And then Tom was telling me something. He says, well, when the humidity rises, the air cools down, and then the heat thing. So maybe then it's not so uninhabitable. So we also then really, really need to, I think, work in tandem with climate scientists to be able to understand that knowledge, to be able to really tap into that kind of knowledge as social scientists, to be able to appreciate what these nuances are of the weather talk and heat talk. And this really threw me out because the conversation only just happened a week ago. And I was like, okay, wow, I didn't know that. I had absolutely no idea. So as a social scientist, I'm constantly beating myself on the head that in heat talk, I really, really have to remain cognizant about what climate scientists are also saying about heat and humidity and these kinds of things, because that conversation cannot be separate. So I didn't address all the questions because I was very clearly forgotten also. Don't go ahead.
Few other questions.
Yeah.
But I must say that for some reason, the way the camera is reflecting on you, it says record high. So it's kind of almost lifting your top at the record high temperature in Toronto. And it's showing on your head. Yeah, it is absolutely safe. So heat is sort of transgressed from Karachi to Toronto. So further questions, if people have for Anwar? Any other thoughts come to you talking about heat in general? Go ahead.
I was wondering what role do you think should urban land play in the kind of society?
Specifically the urban lab in Karachi.
For example, yeah.
So that's a really fantastic question because I'm going to the World Urban Forum and I'm on